John chapter 8. Now, we are a society, by the way, one of the things that got dropped this week was the PowerPoint. So we didn't have a countdown beforehand. We didn't have a video beforehand. Recently, the media was so caught up in a scandal that they failed to properly report the coming of the third biggest hurricane in U.S. history. And if the media doesn't give something press, it's not important. Yet I can't blame the media for chasing after a sex scandal. I remember back in 1982 when I was in the, this would have been 83, excuse me, 1983 when I was in the newspaper business, nude pictures of Miss America became public. And that was the biggest single weekly sales increase that I had. But we didn't have the nude pictures in the newspaper, but people wanted to know about the scandal. And that, listen, I made so much money that week that I bought a brand new color TV console from Highland Appliance because I made so much additional money on that week. You know, politicians, TV and movie stars, news personalities, televangelists, even church pastors have all been caught up in sex scandals at some point. And whether these people come back all depends on how they cope with the situation. For example, it seems like whether they did it or not, people who come out and apologize and ask for forgiveness generally come out pretty good, even come out bigger and better than ever. I'll take Vanessa Williams and Jimmy Swaggart and Hugh Grant, for example. And those people that arrogantly proclaim their innocence and their lack of guilt, like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein, somehow those folks end up in jail. Now, sometimes scandal arises because people are trying to bring other people down. Case in point, Brett Kavanaugh and Bill Clinton. Those sex scandals only came out because they wanted to bring those two people down. But this is nothing new. People have tried to use sex scandals, I think, since the beginning of time, and they even tried to use it against Jesus, as we see here in John chapter 8. Let's begin reading with verse 1. Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives. And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. Now there's four things here that I want you to take note of. First, Jesus was teaching in the temple to a crowd of people that were there. Now, I say a crowd, and it's safe to say a crowd, because when Jesus spoke in the open, the crowds we know were recorded up to 5,000 people came to hear him speak. So if Jesus just went into the temple and started speaking, people would come and congregate around him. So there would be a crowd around him. In fact, if Jesus spoke in a house, the house would become so packed that if you wanted to get in, you had to poke a hole through the roof and get lowered down. Now, we only see a couple of occasions, like with Nicodemus, where Jesus only talked to one or two people when he taught. He usually spoke to crowds. Second, the religious leaders brought a woman who was caught having adulterous sex. Now, some believe that she was a harlot, which means that though committing a sin, it was not her sin that was being committed, who was committing adultery, but her client's. And the one who was committing adultery was not brought before Jesus. Or it could have been an adulterous affair. But because the man wasn't there, who was caught in the act of adultery, it tells us that the reason they were there was not to preserve the law, but for some other clandestine reason. In other words, the act was conveniently taking place at the time that Jesus was in Jerusalem speaking in the temple to a crowd. Kind of sounds like a setup to me, doesn't it to you? Third, you drag a naked woman through the streets of Jerusalem. Well, she was caught in the very act of adultery, so she most likely had no clothes on. A woman who was pretty enough to cause a Jewish man to cheat on his wife, this too would attract a crowd. And people would follow this parade headed towards the temple. So here we have those that came to hear Jesus teach, and those who had their pockets filled with rocks ready to stone this woman to death. And then we have the fourth thing that takes place here. Jesus was at the temple teaching at the end of the Feast of the Tabernacle. Now you see, Jesus' primary ministry had switched from Jerusalem, well, it had primarily settled in Galilee, because John chapter 7 verse 1 tells us, after these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, because the Jews sought to kill him. In other words, Jesus stayed out of Judea and Jerusalem. But Jesus remained obedient to the law. And though the Feast of the Tabernacles was not an official holiday, Jesus would still observe the Jewish holidays. And his enemies knew that. So on this particular trip to Jerusalem, they laid a couple of traps for him. They tried to trap him the day before into saying something blasphemous about the Sabbath day. And this to them, they thought was about the only thing that they could get Jesus on, because he had an answer for everything else. But you know, they were always trying to lay no-win scenarios before Jesus. They were always trying to lay a no-win scenario where they could trap him, whether it was putting a man with a withered hand in the synagogue and tempting him to heal that man, which they saw as working on the Sabbath day. Or coming to him and saying, what say ye, Master? Should we pay taxes to the Romans? No-win scenarios. Or, in this case, they thought they had the perfect no-win scenario. This woman was caught in the very act of adultery. What say ye? You know, these were things that they constantly tried to get Jesus caught up in. But here we have, it's not a typical Sunday morning at the temple. This is the last chance for the pilgrims before they go home to go to the temple. So what do? It was a fairly busy Sunday morning at the temple. So they did everything humanly possible to get a crowd there in order to embarrass Jesus, in order to bring Jesus down, in order to pit the social order against the law of Moses. That was quite a juggling act that the Pharisees and the scribes would commit during that day and time, because anything could be declared treasonous to the Roman Empire. They thought it was the perfect trap. Let's continue reading. Verse 5. Now Moses in the law commands us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. So you see, the notorious trap has a purpose. But Jesus stooped down with his finger and wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. You know, Jesus' opponents tried everything under the sun to try to trap him. And they saw this as the perfect trap. I mean, if Jesus goes and says, stone her, then okay, to some Jews, he would be in compliance with the law. But Jesus was also known as an agent of mercy. And because of the fact that people saw him as an agent of mercy, those people who came to hear Jesus speak that morning, if he would have said, stone her, they would have gone away that day thinking, well, I'm confused. He says one thing, but he does another. Also, if he would have said stone her, it would have called for capital punishment. Now, the Romans gave the Jewish leaders some leeway on certain things that they could punish people for and what they could not punish people for. And obviously, a woman caught in the act of adultery was not part of that list. And so for them to ask Jesus this question would have brought down the Romans' authority upon Jesus, because you can bet Jesus' enemies would have made sure that the Romans knew that Jesus had said such a treasonous thing against their law. So if Jesus would have said stone her, he would have risked his ministry, and he would have risked his very life. But if Jesus said spare her, he would have been accused of teaching against the law of Moses, and he would have been undermining all that they held sacred. So he was either going to be antisocial or anti-law, a no-win situations. They thought they had him in a perfect trap. Now, how did Jesus respond to their question? He said nothing. He averted his eyes from the woman and he drew in the ground and said nothing. You know, sometimes when people ask you these hypothetical questions, and that's all they are, a hypothetical question, sometimes the best thing to do is just to keep your mouth shut. But it really didn't matter what his answer was going to be, because you see, blasphemy was one of the things that the Jewish leaders could kill somebody, could stone somebody for. You look at Acts chapter 7 and 8, the execution of Stephen. They couldn't execute Jesus because they couldn't find anything that Jesus did that was against their law. But they executed Stephen because they deemed what he said was blasphemous. And blasphemy was one of those laws that they could execute somebody. And whatever answer Jesus came up with, you can bet the Jewish leaders are going to find it as blasphemous. So again, even a worst case scenario. Boy, isn't it one of those days when you wake up in the morning, you think everything's going to go all right, and then somebody asks a stupid question and your life gets thrown upside down. Verse 7. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. Okay, mind's eye. I picture this. Every time I think of this, I picture it. I picture Jesus sitting on the ground, doodling on the ground, and they just keep pestering him. And so he stands up, and he walks over, and he finds a rock, and he picks it up, and he hands it to the ringleader, the guy who's doing the most talking, because in a mob, there's always one idiot who does the most talking, right? And he hands the stone to that guy, and he says, okay, let he who is without sin cast the first stone at her. You know, we abbreviate that verse, but it's been in the Bible, and people may misquote it, but it all stands to reason. Now, this is one of the few times in the New Testament where the Greek is translated gender specific. There's only really three places in the Bible, in the New Testament, where it's gender specific. Jesus was a man, ministers are to be men, and here. Jesus was addressing men in this situation. Now, I think the reason it's gender specific is because of this. There may have been women in the crowd, and the general message that is here is a message that we can all take to heart. But you see, stoning was only supposed to be done by men. And so Jesus was still honoring the law here by addressing this crowd as men. Okay? Obviously, it was in the open court and not in the men's court, where women were not allowed, and even the Pharisees and the scribes were not rude enough to drag a woman into that court in the temple. Let's continue reading. Verse 9. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And he would, oh, by the way, when you see in the Bible where it says men or sons, just put your own name in there. It doesn't matter. It's not gender specific, but there's only a few cases where it is. Verse 8. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the eldest, even to the last, and Jesus was left alone with a woman standing in the midst. Now, on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, starting with verse 3, Jesus said, And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, when consider not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, Let me pull out the mote from thine eye, and behold a beam in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Okay, I have to say this. Why do we as Christians, why do we as churches, why do we as pastors spend so much time judging other people? It's a wasted time. Why do we look at the faults of others and think our sins are nothing? Why do we spend so much time considering one sin in a person's life and ignoring the list of sins that we possess in our own lives? Let's go back to the opening statement, okay? About the scandal that pushed the third largest hurricane in U.S. history to the back page. And ladies, maybe you can understand us white men a little better. When we got a little upset during the confirmation hearing of Brett Kavanaugh, and unfortunately I have to use myself as the example. If you were to bring up my sins that I committed in my 60s or 50s, I could easily explain them away. And you would easily forgive me for them. After all, they're probably sins that you do yourself, and, well, I know it's wrong, but it happens. So you'd forgive me of those sins. And so if we were to say, okay, well, what about the sins you committed in your 40s? And in my 40s, I was fighting for my professional life, and I was always trying to put myself in the best light that I could possible. And perhaps when I presented that, I was putting myself in a brighter light that really should have been shone so bright, and I might have made some conjectures that turned into truths. I justified it. But you know what? I may not have always been honest. And I ask forgiveness of that. But you know what, you forgive me for that, and you think, well, wait a minute, what are these sins he did in his 60s, and these sins he did in his 50s, and he's just admitted that he's not always honest with us. Maybe we should look at his business practices when he was in business and in his 30s, and I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. If you do that, only look at my business practices after I was 33 when I came back to the Lord, not before. And if you're going back to my 20s, don't look at anything before July the 1st, 1982, the day I got married. And whatever you do, don't go back to my high school days or my college days. And if I went to a party during those days and times, then guess what? I didn't remember what happened the next day, let alone 40 years later. And don't go back to my adolescence or my early teen years. This was a tough sermon. That's what Brett Kavanaugh reminded us of. Was the sins of our life, going all the way back. You ever wonder why it was the elders that dropped the stones first and walked away? Because when you start looking at your life backwards, you see what a rotten person you really are. You see yourself as a person that doesn't deserve forgiveness. You see yourself as a person who's guilty of sin and as guilty as sin. You know, the younger people came to that conclusion, but it took them a little longer. They didn't have a lifetime of sins to look back on. But they soon realized, as the elder men did, that they were just as sinful as they were. And they all came to the realization that they were judging a woman that was no worse than they were. They all realized they were more guilty than she. But praise God for verses 10 and 11. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Has no man condemned thee? And she said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. You know, the Tom Miller version of this verse goes something like this. Not guilty. Now go and sin no more. If you ever wondered how God reacts to your failures, to your shortcomings, to your outright willful sins, it's not with thunder and lightning. It's not with a heavy hammer. Oh, he knows what you did, and I can tell you that he may or may not be happy about it. It may all be part of his plan. Actually, in the long run, it is. But you'll spend more time like the old man judging yourself. And you'll spend more time feeling guilty about what you've done than he ever will. Because he died on the cross for us. He died on the cross for you. And so whatever your failings or your shortcomings or your outright willful sin was, he's already forgiven it. He's already said not guilty. So go and sin no more. It doesn't matter what I did in my early teens or what I don't remember happening in the parties between the time I was in high school to the time I got married. It doesn't matter what my business practices were, and it doesn't matter if I was completely honest with people in my 40s or what I may have done in my 50s or 60s. He said, not guilty. Go and sin no more. You know the shame of this whole story is the old men walked away guilty. The young men walked away guilty. Only one person in that story walked away saved, not judged by Jesus. And I guess I can make this as flowery as possible. But how are you going to walk away from this church this morning? Are you going to walk away guilty? Are you going to walk away not guilty? I guess there's no better call for an invitation than that. Let's stand. Lord, you know, it's kind of tough when you look back at your life. The old story, I saw that my life flashed before my eyes. But Lord, we have a whole lifetime that we live on this plane. And we'll constantly be bombarded with temptation, and there will be times when we will fall to sin. But I praise your holy name that there was a day when you asked me, where are your accusers? And then you said, not guilty. Go and sin no more. Lord, if there's anyone here today that needs to know you, who feels the sting of guilt, and they just need to hear those words, not guilty. And Lord, let them make that commitment towards you today. Lord, we just ask you to touch our hearts, convict us of our sins, and let us feel the rush of your forgiving touch. In your precious name. Amen. Oh, Angel, 7 this evening. You're all welcome to come. Hey, the wonderful thing about Nehemiah, you can jump in any place. Well, I missed 1 through 6, Pastor. Now you can come in. You'll get a lesson out of 7 too. So, anyway, what is God good?
All the time.
You know what? Life is better when He said not guilty. Amen. Amen. So, hey, we're 4 minutes early. You know, I don't have anybody to go eat lunch with, so if anybody wants to ask me out, and daughters, I'm available. God bless. You're dismissed. Oh yeah, Jen is back.